Sarah Chen pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and glanced at the clock above the circulation desk. 3 more minutes until the Millfield Public Library closed for the day. 3 more minutes until her old life ended forever. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was surrounded by thousands of books filled with adventures she'd only dreamed of living. The last patron shuffled out with an armload of romance novels, and Sarah began her final closing routine. She'd done this same dance hundreds of times over the past 3 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, every action carried the weight of finality. She straightened the magazines on the rack near the entrance, her fingers lingering on a copy of Military Times that someone had left behind. The cover story featured a female Marine who had just graduated from infantry training. "Still planning on going through with it?" asked Margaret, the head librarian, as she emerged from the back office with her oversized purse and a look of motherly concern. Margaret had been like a second mother to Sarah since she'd started working there fresh out of college. She was also the only person who knew about the papers Sarah had signed at the recruitment office 2 months ago. "I leave for basic training on Monday," Sarah replied, clicking off her computer terminal. "My mind's made up." Margaret shook her head and sighed. 25 years old, master's degree in literature, and you want to go play soldier. "I'll never understand it." Sarah had tried explaining it before, but how do you tell someone that you feel like you're suffocating in safety? That every day feels like you're living someone else's life? That sometimes when you're shelving books about brave people doing impossible things, you wonder what would happen if you stopped reading about heroes and tried being one instead? "It's not playing, Margaret," Sarah said gently, slipping her cardigan off the back of her chair. "And I'm not trying to be a hero. I just want to do something that matters." The truth was more complicated than that. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her grandfather had served in Korea, her father in Vietnam, and her older brother Jake had done 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took his life 2 years ago. The flag that had draped his coffin was now folded in a triangle on her apartment's mantelpiece, and sometimes late at night, she'd stare at it and wonder if she had even half the courage he'd shown. Margaret locked the front door behind them, and they stood for a moment on the library steps. The evening air carried the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass, and the sounds of suburban Ohio life drifted around them. Kids playing in the distance, lawnmowers humming, screen doors slamming. It was peaceful. It was safe. It was everything Sarah was about to leave behind. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your brother's death wasn't your fault." Sarah's throat tightened. Margaret was the only person who'd ever said it out loud, but it didn't make hearing it any easier. "I know that. Do you?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had asked herself the same thing countless times. Was she joining the military to honor Jake's memory, or was she running from the guilt that had eaten at her since the day 2 soldiers in dress uniforms had knocked on her parents' door? She'd been the one who was supposed to be strong. She'd been the one who'd always protected Jake when they were kids, even though he was 2 years older. She'd been the one their parents called when they needed something done right. But she hadn't been there when Jake needed her most. She'd been here in Ohio, stamping due dates on library books while he was bleeding out on a road in Kandahar. "I need to do this," Sarah said finally. "I can't explain why, but I need to do this." Margaret nodded and pulled her into a hug that smelled like lavender and old books. "Then, you better come home in one piece, because this place won't be the same without you." The drive back to her apartment gave Sarah 30 minutes to think, and thinking was dangerous territory these days. She'd done her research. She knew the statistics. She knew that most women who enlisted ended up in support roles, far from any actual fighting. She knew that the chances of her ever seeing combat were slim, and slimmer still that she'd be allowed anywhere near the specialized training she secretly hoped for. But she also knew something else. Ever since she was a kid, Sarah had been able to see things other people missed. Details that others overlooked. Patterns that weren't obvious. Her college professors had called it exceptional observational skills. Her brother Jake had called it being freaky good at Where's Waldo. Whatever it was, Sarah had spent her whole life feeling like she was watching the world through a magnifying glass while everyone else squinted at it with naked eyes. In her apartment, Sarah sat on her couch and pulled out the folder of papers the recruiter had given her. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been surprised when she'd walked into his office. Most people were. Sarah knew she didn't look like soldier material. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds, with delicate features and glasses that made her look more like a graduate student than a warrior, she wasn't exactly recruitment poster material. "What's your interest in the military, Miss Chen?" Rodriguez had asked. "I want to serve my country," she'd replied, which was true but incomplete. "Any particular field interest you?" This was where Sarah had made her first strategic decision. "I'd like to be considered for any role where my skills might be useful. I'm detail-oriented, patient, and I have excellent hand-eye coordination." Rodriguez had nodded and started filling out paperwork. He'd assumed she was talking about administrative work or maybe something technical. Sarah hadn't corrected him. She'd let him assume what he wanted to assume while she quietly researched everything she could find about military occupational specialties that matched her actual interests. What Sarah hadn't told Rodriguez, or Margaret, or anyone else, was that she'd been shooting since she was 8 years old. Her grandfather had taught her on an old bolt-action rifle at the family farm, and she'd discovered something remarkable: she was naturally, almost supernaturally accurate. Not just good. Not just above average. She could put 5 rounds through the same hole at 200 yards with iron sights, and she'd been doing it consistently since she was a teenager. Her grandfather had noticed, of course. He'd been a Marine marksman in Korea, and he'd recognized something in Sarah that even she didn't fully understand yet. He'd started bringing her more challenging targets, longer distances, different conditions. By the time she was in high school, Sarah could outshoot grown men with decades of hunting experience, and she did it so quietly and humbly that most people never realized what they were seeing. "You've got the gift," her grandfather had told her once, watching her put 3 rounds into a target at 300 yards. "Some folks spend their whole lives trying to learn what you just know naturally." "What gift?" she'd asked. "Seeing what needs to be seen, when it needs to be seen, and doing what needs to be done about it." Now, sitting in her apartment with her deployment orders in her lap, Sarah wondered if her grandfather had been right. She wondered if there was more to her abilities than just good eyesight and steady hands. She wondered if the restlessness she felt, the constant sense that she was meant for something bigger, might actually mean something. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Her mother's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Mom. Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" Her mother's voice carried the weight of every conversation they'd had about Sarah's decision over the past 2 months. "It's not too late to change your mind." Sarah looked around her apartment. The furniture she'd bought at discount stores. The bookshelves lined with stories about other people's adventures. The quiet, safe, predictable life she'd built for herself. "I'm sure. Your father's proud of you. You know that, right? He's worried, but he's proud." "I know. And Jake would be proud too." Sarah's eyes went to the folded flag on her mantelpiece. "I hope so." After she hung up, Sarah spent the evening packing. She'd sold most of her furniture and donated boxes of books to the library. Everything she owned now fit into 2 duffel bags and a backpack. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time. As she folded her civilian clothes, Sarah thought about the conversation she'd had with her grandfather a few months before he'd passed away. They'd been sitting on his porch, watching the sunset, and he'd asked her what she planned to do with her life. "I don't know," she'd admitted. "I feel like I'm waiting for something to happen, but I don't know what." "Sometimes," he'd said, "the thing you're waiting for is the courage to stop waiting." That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about courage. About her brother, who'd run toward danger when others ran away. About her grandfather, who'd left his farm at 18 to fight in a war halfway around the world. About the generations of Chen family members who'd found their purpose in service to something bigger than themselves. She thought about the shooting competitions she'd won as a teenager, and how she'd always downplayed her abilities because she was afraid of the attention. She thought about the times she'd watched military documentaries and felt a strange pull toward the stories of snipers and special operations soldiers, men and women who operated in the shadows and made impossible shots when everything depended on it. Most of all, she thought about the feeling she'd carried around for as long as she could remember, the sense that her real life was waiting for her somewhere else, in some situation that would demand everything she had to give. Monday morning came faster than expected. Sarah loaded her bags into her car and drove to the recruitment center where a bus was waiting to take her and 17 other new recruits to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training. As she looked back at the town where she'd spent her entire life, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, excitement mixed with terror, the particular combination that comes when you know you're about to find out what you're really made of. The other recruits on the bus were mostly young men, 18 and 19 years old, talking loudly about video games and movies. Sarah sat near the back with her headphones on, listening to music and watching the landscape change as they drove south. She thought about the lies of omission she'd told during her recruitment process. She thought about the specialized training programs she'd researched but hadn't mentioned to anyone. And she thought about something else her grandfather had told her once, something she'd never forgotten: the most dangerous person on any battlefield is the one everyone underestimates. As the bus pulled through the gates of Fort Leonard Wood, Sarah Chen felt like she was finally coming home to a place she'd never been before. She had no idea that within 18 months, enemy combatants would be referring to her by a nickname whispered in fear across 3 different theaters of war. She had no idea that her drill sergeant's initial dismissal of the quiet girl with glasses would give way to something approaching awe. All she knew was that she'd spent 25 years waiting for her life to begin, and it was finally happening. The bus stopped, and a drill sergeant climbed aboard with a voice like controlled thunder. "Welcome to the United States Army, recruits. You have 30 seconds to get off my bus and fall in." Sarah shouldered her pack and followed the others outside. The Missouri sun beat down on them as they stood in formation, and she could smell dust and diesel fuel and something else, something that might have been opportunity. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Chen felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 8 weeks later, Sarah stood at attention in the sweltering heat of a Missouri afternoon, watching Drill Sergeant Martinez pace in front of their formation. Basic training had been everything the horror stories promised and more, but Sarah had survived it. More than survived it, she'd excelled. Her test scores were near perfect, her physical fitness evaluations exceeded standards, and she'd earned the grudging respect of instructors who'd initially dismissed her as another college kid who'd wash out in the first week. "Private Chen," Martinez barked, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "Yes, Drill Sergeant." "Front and center." Sarah stepped forward, her heart rate staying steady despite the attention. She'd learned early that in the Army, being singled out could mean either recognition or trouble, and there was usually no way to know which until it was too late. Martinez held a manila folder in his hands, and his expression was unreadable. "Private Chen, according to your file, you've qualified expert on every weapons system we've put in your hands. You've also demonstrated exceptional observational skills during tactical exercises." "Yes, Drill Sergeant." "Tell me, Private, what do you know about scout snipers?" The question hit Sarah like an electrical shock, but she kept her face carefully neutral. Scout snipers were elite soldiers, specially trained for reconnaissance and precision shooting. They were the ghosts on the battlefield, the ones who could eliminate high-value targets from impossible distances. They were also, traditionally, almost exclusively male. Scout snipers are reconnaissance specialists trained in long-range marksmanship, Drill Sergeant. "That's right. And, due to a clerical error in your assignment paperwork, you've been selected for sniper school evaluation." Martinez's eyes narrowed. Normally, this would be corrected immediately. Female soldiers aren't assigned to sniper training. Sarah's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice level. "I understand, Drill Sergeant." However, Martinez continued, and Sarah caught something unexpected in his tone: "Your scores are so far above average that someone upstairs wants to see what you can do. You've got 72 hours to decide if you want to attempt sniper school, knowing full well that you'll probably be the only woman there, and that the washout rate is north of 70%. The formation around Sarah was dead silent. She could feel the eyes of her fellow soldiers on her, some curious, others skeptical. She thought about the safe assignment she'd been expecting, probably in intelligence or communications. She thought about the reasonable, sensible choice that would keep her out of harm's way. Then, she thought about her grandfather's words: "Sometimes the thing you're waiting for is the courage to stop waiting." "I'd like to attempt sniper school, Drill Sergeant." Martinez nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. Report to Building 752 at 0500 tomorrow for pre-screening." "And, Chen?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant. Don't make me regret recommending you." That evening, Sarah lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling while her bunkmates peppered her with questions she couldn't fully answer. Why had she volunteered for something so difficult? What did she know about sniping? Did she really think she could make it through training that broke grown men? The truth was complicated. Sarah had spent her entire adult life feeling like she was hiding her true capabilities, downplaying her natural abilities to avoid making others uncomfortable. The shooting skills she'd developed as a child, the uncanny awareness of her surroundings that had always set her apart, the way she could spot details that others missed, all of it had been carefully contained and controlled. But, in the army, those same abilities were suddenly valuable. More than valuable, they were necessary. For the first time in her life, Sarah was in an environment where being exceptional at something dangerous wasn't a liability but an asset. The next morning, Sarah reported to Building 752 at exactly 0500. The pre-screening facility was smaller than she'd expected, just a few offices and a classroom attached to an indoor shooting range. She was greeted by Staff Sergeant Williams, a lean man with intelligent eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested he was always watching and evaluating. "Private Chen, I've reviewed your file," Williams said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Impressive scores across the board. But sniper training isn't just about shooting. It's about mental toughness, patience, and the ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure. Tell me why you think you belong here." Sarah had prepared for this question, but, sitting across from Williams, she decided to abandon her rehearsed answer and tell the truth. "I don't know if I belong here, Staff Sergeant. But I know that I spent my whole life feeling like I was capable of more than what I was doing. I know that I can shoot better than most people, and I know that when things get chaotic, I get calmer. I don't know if that's enough, but I'd like the chance to find out." Williams studied her for a long moment. "How long have you been shooting?" "Since I was 8, Staff Sergeant. My grandfather taught me." "Any competitive experience?" Sarah hesitated. She'd won numerous shooting competitions as a teenager, but she'd always competed under her grandfather's name to avoid attention at school. "Some local competitions. Nothing major." Williams made a note in his file. "We're going to start with a basic marksmanship evaluation. Follow me." The shooting range was longer than any Sarah had used before, with targets set at various distances from 100 to 800 yards. Williams handed her an M24 sniper rifle, a precision weapon she'd read about but never fired. "This is your primary tool," Williams explained. 7.62 NATO round, effective range out to 800 yards in the right hands. "We'll start at 300 yards. 10 shots, prone position. Your goal is to group all 10 shots within a 6-inch circle." Sarah accepted the rifle and moved to the firing line. The weapon felt heavier than the hunting rifle she'd trained with, but as she settled into position and looked through the scope, something clicked into place. The distant target came into sharp focus, and the world around her seemed to quiet. She fired her first shot and watched through the scope as the bullet struck just left of center on the target. She made a small adjustment and fired again. This time, the impact was dead center. She fired the remaining 8 shots in a steady rhythm, each one landing within inches of the first. When she set the rifle down, Williams was studying the target through binoculars. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught something that might have been surprise. "That's a 3-inch group at 300 yards, Williams said. "Have you ever fired that particular rifle before?" "No, Staff Sergeant." "Ever used that particular scope?" "No, Staff Sergeant." Williams made another note. "We're going to move back to 500 yards. Same drill, 10 shots." The pattern repeated. Sarah's grouping at 500 yards was slightly larger but still well within acceptable limits for a trained sniper, let alone someone who'd never had professional instruction. Williams had her move to 600 yards, then 700. By the time they reached 800 yards, Sarah was shooting at a target that looked like a postage stamp through the scope. The wind had picked up, adding an additional variable she had to account for. But, as she settled into position, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always accompanied her best shooting. The chatter in her mind quieted, her breathing slowed, and the world narrowed down to just her, the rifle, and the distant target. 10 shots later, Williams was on the radio calling for someone to verify the target. Sarah had put 7 of her 10 shots into a 4-inch group at 800 yards, a performance that would have been impressive for a trained sniper, let alone a recruit with no formal training. "Private Chen," Williams said, his professional composure finally cracking slightly, "where exactly did you learn to shoot?" "My grandfather had a farm in Ohio, Staff Sergeant. We used to practice on weekends." "What kind of practice?" Sarah thought about those lazy Saturday afternoons, her grandfather setting up increasingly challenging shots while he told stories about his time in Korea. He'd set up targets at different distances and have me shoot in different conditions. Wind, rain, different times of day. He said shooting was about more than just pulling the trigger. Williams nodded slowly. Your grandfather was a smart man. Did he ever mention anything about military marksmanship? He was a Marine sniper in Korea, Staff Sergeant. For the first time, Williams smiled. That explains a few things. Private, based on what I've seen today, I'm recommending you for sniper school. But I need you to understand what you're getting into. The training is brutal. The physical demands are extreme. The mental pressure will test you in ways you can't imagine. And you'll be doing it as the only woman in a class of men who may not want you there. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the same feeling she'd experienced before every major decision in her life. Then, she thought about her brother Jake, who'd never hesitated when duty called. She thought about her grandfather, who'd left everything familiar to serve his country in a foreign war. I understand, Staff Sergeant. I'd like to try. Williams closed her file. Sniper school starts Monday. You'll be part of Class 23-07. Report to Building 1200 at 0400 for in-processing. And, Chen? Yes, Staff Sergeant? Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong there. I've been evaluating shooters for 8 years, and what you did today was exceptional. But, remember, shooting is only part of what makes a sniper. You'll need to prove you can handle the rest. That weekend, Sarah called her parents to tell them about her assignment. Her mother cried, her father was quietly proud, and both of them worried about what she was getting herself into. She also called Margaret at the library. Sniper school? Margaret's voice carried across the phone line with a mixture of disbelief and concern. Sarah, what happened to wanting to serve your country? This sounds like something else entirely. Sarah understood Margaret's concern, but she also knew something Margaret couldn't. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something instead of away from it. The restlessness that had driven her to enlist was still there, but now it had direction. I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing, Sarah said. I can't explain it better than that. On Sunday night, Sarah packed her gear and prepared for the next phase of her military career. She'd read everything she could find about sniper training, and she knew what was waiting for her. Weeks of physical torture designed to break down recruits who weren't mentally tough enough for the mission. Classroom instruction in ballistics, weather patterns, camouflage, and reconnaissance techniques. Field exercises that would test every skill she'd learned and several she hadn't. And, through it all, she'd be the only woman in a world that had traditionally belonged entirely to men. Sarah lay in her bunk that night and thought about fear. She was afraid, but it was a different kind of fear than she'd experienced before. It wasn't the paralyzing anxiety of not knowing what she was capable of. It was the sharp, focused fear of someone about to find out exactly what she was made of. She thought about her grandfather's old rifle back home, the one he'd taught her to shoot with. She thought about the way he'd always pushed her to take more difficult shots, to shoot in worse conditions, to challenge herself beyond what seemed reasonable. The rifle doesn't make the sniper, he'd told her once. The sniper makes the rifle. And the best snipers are the ones who understand that shooting is just the beginning. The real skill is in seeing what needs to be seen and doing what needs to be done about it. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, she wondered if her grandfather had somehow known this day would come. If all those years of patient instruction had been preparing her for something neither of them could have imagined. Tomorrow, she would begin the most difficult training the military had to offer. Tomorrow, she would start the process of becoming one of the Army's most elite soldiers. Tomorrow, Sarah Chen would begin her journey toward becoming the kind of sniper that enemy combatants would whisper about in fear, the kind whose reputation would precede her into every conflict zone she entered. But tonight, she was still just a librarian from Ohio who could shoot better than most people and had the courage to find out what that might mean. The alarm went off at 0330, but Sarah was already awake. She'd been lying in her bunk for the past hour, listening to the sounds of 19 other soldiers preparing for what would either be another day of grueling training or their last day in sniper school. After 6 weeks of the most demanding military instruction she'd ever experienced, Sarah had learned that in sniper school, every sunrise brought the possibility of failure. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and made her way to the mess hall. The other soldiers in her class moved with the efficient silence of men who'd learned to conserve their energy for the challenges ahead. most of them no longer looked at her with open skepticism. Those who'd started the course questioning whether a woman belonged in sniper school had either washed out themselves or been forced to acknowledge that Sarah Chen wasn't washing out anytime soon. But acceptance and respect were different things, and Sarah had learned to tell the difference. Sergeant First Class Morrison was waiting for them in the classroom when they assembled at 0500. Morrison was a legend in the sniper community, a man who'd spent 15 years in special operations and had more confirmed kills than most soldiers had missions. He was also the instructor who'd been most vocal about his doubts regarding Sarah's place in the program. "Today we begin the stalking phase of your training," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who taught this course dozens of times. "For the next 2 weeks, you'll be tested on your ability to move unseen across hostile terrain, establish firing positions, and engage targets without being detected." Sarah had been looking forward to this phase. The classroom instruction had been demanding but manageable. The physical fitness requirements had pushed her to her limits but hadn't broken her. The marksmanship training had actually been easier than she'd expected, given her natural abilities and her grandfather's early instruction. But stalking was different. Stalking required a combination of patience, cunning, and physical endurance that couldn't be taught from a textbook. It was the part of sniper training that separated the merely skilled from the truly elite. Morrison's eyes found Sarah in the formation. Private Chen, front and center. Sarah stepped forward, her stomach tightening. Being singled out by Morrison was never a good sign. "Private Chen, you've performed adequately in the marksmanship phases of this course," Morrison said, his tone suggesting that adequately was being generous. "But stalking requires more than just the ability to shoot straight. It requires the kind of mental toughness that can't be faked or compensated for. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "Yes, Sergeant." Morrison studied her for a long moment. Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes, the skepticism that had been there since her first day. She'd proven she could shoot, but Morrison clearly believed that the upcoming phase would expose whatever weakness he was certain she possessed. "We'll see," Morrison said finally. "Your first stalking exercise begins at 0800. You'll have 4 hours to move 1,200 meters across open terrain, establish a firing position within 200 meters of your target, and engage without being detected by observer teams. Failure to complete the exercise successfully will result in immediate dismissal from the program." After the briefing, Sarah joined the other soldiers in preparing their gear. The stalking phase required different equipment than the marksmanship training. Ghillie suits that would help them blend into the environment. Specialized optics for spotting observer teams. Camouflage materials they'd use to break up their outline and movement. Private First Class Rodriguez, one of the few soldiers who treated Sarah as an equal from the beginning, helped her adjust her ghillie suit. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Sarah tested the movement in her camouflaged uniform. The ghillie suit was hot, bulky, and restrictive, but it would make her nearly invisible once she learned to use it properly. "As ready as I can be." "Morrison's been riding you harder than the rest of us," Rodriguez observed. "Don't let him get in your head." Sarah appreciated the support, but she also understood Morrison's position. He was responsible for training soldiers who would operate in the most dangerous environments the military had to offer. If he had doubts about her abilities, those doubts were based on years of experience with what it took to survive as a sniper in combat. The stalking course was located in a valley several miles from the main training facility. As Sarah studied the terrain from the starting point, she could see why it had been chosen for this exercise. The ground was mostly open, with scattered patches of brush and a few small hills that provided limited concealment. Moving across it without being detected would require every skill they'd learned about reading terrain, using natural camouflage, and moving with patience that bordered on the supernatural. The observer teams were already in position, scanning the course with high-powered optics and radio communication. Their job was to spot the advancing students and call in their locations, eliminating them from the exercise. Sarah could see their positions marked with small flags, but she knew the actual observers would be much harder to spot. "Chen, you're up," Morrison called. Sarah moved to the starting line, her rifle secured across her back and her gear distributed to minimize noise and bulk. The target area was marked by a small building 1,200 meters away, barely visible through the morning haze. "Remember," Morrison said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge, "this isn't just about reaching the target. It's about doing it without being seen." Observer teams are looking for movement, unnatural shapes, anything that doesn't belong. One mistake and you're done. Sarah nodded and began her movement across the course. The first few hundred meters were the most dangerous, as she had to cross completely open ground with no natural concealment. She moved in short rushes, timing her movement to take advantage of wind that would disguise any noise, and stopping frequently to observe the observer positions. The ghillie suit was even hotter than she'd expected, and, within the first hour, Sarah was soaked in sweat. But she'd learned to ignore discomfort during the previous weeks of training. The key to stalking wasn't physical comfort, it was mental discipline and the ability to move with a patience that felt almost meditative. After 2 hours, Sarah had covered about half the distance to the target. She was lying prone in a small depression, studying the terrain ahead and planning her next movement, when she heard the distinctive crack of Morrison's voice over a loudspeaker. "Chen, you've been spotted. Report to the observation post." Sarah's heart sank. She'd been so focused on her movement that she'd missed something, some detail that had given her away to the observers. She stood and walked to the nearby observation post, where Morrison was waiting with a pair of binoculars and a radio. "What did I do wrong?" Sarah asked. Morrison pointed to a position about 300 meters back along her route. "You disturbed the vegetation when you crossed that open area. Left a trail that was visible from the observer position. In a combat environment, that kind of mistake gets you killed." Sarah looked back at her path and could see what Morrison was talking about. In her eagerness to make progress, she'd been careless about how she moved through a patch of tall grass, leaving a visible trail that an experienced observer could easily spot. "I want you to try again," Morrison said. "But, this time, I want you to think about what it means to truly move unseen. It's not enough to hide from casual observation. You need to move like you don't exist." Sarah returned to the starting point and began again. This time, she moved even more slowly, paying attention not just to her concealment but to every mark she left on the environment. She tested each step before committing her weight, used natural paths through the vegetation, and took twice as long to cover the same ground. The second attempt took her nearly the full 4 hours, but she reached the target area without being detected. As she set up her firing position and prepared to engage the target, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd experienced in training so far. But Morrison wasn't finished with her. "Not bad, Chen," he said when she reported to the observation post after completing the exercise. "But I want to see what you can do under real pressure. Tomorrow, you'll be running the course at night, in the rain, with a time limit of 3 hours instead of 4. The next morning brought exactly the conditions Morrison had promised. Rain fell steadily from a gray sky, turning the stalking course into a muddy obstacle course that would test every skill Sarah had developed. The darkness added another layer of complexity, requiring her to navigate by memory and instinct rather than visual reference points. But, as Sarah began her movement across the course, she realized something unexpected was happening. The conditions that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks ago now felt manageable. The patience she'd developed during hours of marksmanship training translated naturally to the slow, methodical movement required for stalking. The observational skills she'd always possessed, the ability to see details others missed, allowed her to read the terrain and spot concealment opportunities that were invisible to casual observation. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that she possessed something that couldn't be taught, the ability to become completely still, both physically and mentally, for extended periods. While other soldiers struggled with the boredom and discomfort of moving at a snail's pace, Sarah found the experience almost meditative. She completed the night exercise in just under 3 hours, reaching the target area without being detected and successfully engaging her target from a concealed position. When Morrison reviewed her performance, his expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught something different in his eyes. "Chen," he said, "I want to talk to you after the other soldiers complete their exercises." Sarah spent the rest of the morning helping other members of her class prepare for their attempts at the night stalking course. Of the 20 soldiers who'd started sniper school with her, only 12 remained. The others had been eliminated for various reasons: inability to meet marksmanship standards, failure to complete physical requirements, or simple inability to handle the mental pressure of the training. When the last soldier had completed his exercise, Morrison called Sarah aside. "I owe you an apology," Morrison said, his voice carrying a sincerity Sarah hadn't heard from him before. "When you first arrived here, I had serious doubts about whether you belonged in this program. I thought that the physical and mental demands would break you down, and I was concerned about the impact your presence would have on the other soldiers. Sarah waited, unsure how to respond. I was wrong, Morrison continued. You've not only met every standard we've set, you've exceeded most of them. Your marksmanship scores are among the highest I've seen in 15 years of teaching this course. Your performance in the stalking exercises has been flawless. And, perhaps most importantly, you've earned the respect of the other soldiers through your competence and professionalism. Morrison paused and looked out at the training area where Sarah had spent the last 6 weeks pushing herself to limits she hadn't known she possessed. There's something else, Morrison said. I've been in contact with some people about your future assignments. If you graduate from this program, and I believe you will, there are opportunities available to you that go beyond standard sniper duties. What kind of opportunities, Sergeant? The kind I can't discuss here. But, I will say this, your skills and your performance in this program have attracted attention from some very specialized units. Units that operate in places and situations where ordinary soldiers can't function. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and fear. She joined the army hoping to find her place, to discover what she was truly capable of. Now it seemed like that discovery was just the beginning of something much larger. That evening, Sarah called her parents to update them on her progress. Her mother was proud but worried. Her father was quietly amazed that his daughter had succeeded in one of the military's most demanding programs. But it was her conversation with Margaret that stayed with Sarah as she prepared for the final phases of sniper school. You sound different, Margaret said. More confident. Like you found something you were looking for. Sarah considered the observation. I think I have. I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was supposed to be. And who is that? Sarah looked out the window at the training facility where she'd spent the last 6 weeks discovering capabilities she'd never tested and pushing beyond limitations she'd thought were permanent. I'm not sure yet, Sarah said. But I think I'm about to find out. The final phase of sniper school would test everything Sarah had learned about marksmanship, stalking, reconnaissance, and mental toughness. It would also introduce her to advanced techniques and specialized equipment that she'd only read about in military journals. But, most importantly, it would determine whether Sarah Chen was ready for the kind of assignments that Morrison had hinted at, assignments that would take her to places where the margin for error was zero and the consequences of failure were measured in lives lost. As Sarah prepared for sleep on what would be her last night before the final examinations, she thought about the journey that had brought her from a small-town library to one of the military's most elite training programs. She thought about her grandfather, who'd somehow known that the skills he was teaching her would be needed someday for something bigger than weekend target practice. She thought about her brother Jake, whose memory had motivated her to seek something greater than the safe, predictable life she'd been living. And she thought about the feeling she'd carried for so long, the sense that her real life was waiting for her in some situation that would demand everything she had to give. Tomorrow, Sarah would find out if she was ready for that situation. 6 months later, Sarah crouched in a high position 800 meters from a compound in the mountains of Afghanistan, watching her target through the scope of her M24 rifle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, and a steady wind from the west required constant adjustment to her calculations. After 18 weeks of the most intensive military training she'd ever experienced, this was her first real mission, her first opportunity to put everything she'd learned to the test in actual combat. The target was a Taliban commander named Rashid Ahmadi, a man responsible for coordinating attacks against American forces throughout the region. Intelligence reports indicated he would be meeting with other insurgent leaders at the compound this morning, and Sarah's mission was simple: eliminate Ahmadi and provide reconnaissance on the other attendees. Simple in concept, but nothing about Sarah's journey to this moment had been simple. After graduating from sniper school with the highest overall scores in her class, Sarah had been approached by representatives from a unit she'd never heard of, the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, more commonly known as Delta Force. The meeting had taken place in a nondescript office building in North Carolina, and the men who interviewed her had asked questions that went far beyond her military training. Private Chen, the interviewer had said, your instructors describe your capabilities as exceptional. But we need more than exceptional marksmanship. We need soldiers who can operate independently in hostile territory, make complex decisions under pressure, and adapt to situations that can't be anticipated or trained for. Do you believe you possess those qualities? Sarah had thought about the question carefully before answering. I don't know, sir. I know that I've always been able to handle more pressure than most people expected. I know that I work well alone, and I know that I can make difficult decisions when I have to. But, I've never been tested in combat. That's honest, the interviewer had replied. And, honesty is another quality we value. If you're selected for this unit, your training will continue for another 6 months. You'll learn advanced marksmanship techniques, urban warfare tactics, foreign languages, and specialized skills that go far beyond standard sniper training. You'll also be expected to operate in some of the most dangerous environments the military has to offer. The additional training had been unlike anything Sarah had experienced. While sniper school had focused primarily on marksmanship and fieldcraft, Delta Force training covered everything from close-quarters combat to advanced surveillance techniques. Sarah had learned to shoot accurately with a dozen different weapons systems, to move silently through urban environments, and to gather intelligence using methods that blurred the line between military operations and espionage. She'd also learned that her natural abilities, the skills her grandfather had helped her develop on weekend shooting trips, translated remarkably well to the kind of precision work that Delta Force required. Sarah could not only make difficult shots under pressure, she could do it consistently, day after day, mission after mission. But, all of that training had led to this moment, her first live target, her first real mission, her first opportunity to prove that she belonged among the military's most elite soldiers. Through her scope, Sarah watched the compound come to life. Women in traditional dress moved between buildings, children played in the courtyard, and armed men took positions around the perimeter. The scene looked almost peaceful, but Sarah knew that several of the men she was observing had blood on their hands, American blood. Her radio crackled quietly. Overwatch, this is Command. Status report. Command, this is Overwatch, Sarah whispered into her microphone. Target area is active. Multiple personnel moving around the compound. No sign of primary target yet. Copy, Overwatch. Maintain observation. Primary target expected to arrive within the hour. Sarah settled deeper into her position and continued her surveillance. Her hide was carefully constructed using local materials, designed to blend seamlessly with the rocky terrain. She'd been in position since before dawn, moving into place during the cover of darkness and settling in for what could be an hours-long wait. The patience required for this kind of work was something that came naturally to Sarah. While other soldiers struggled with the boredom and physical discomfort of extended observation, Sarah found the experience focused and meditative. Her mind was completely absorbed in the task, watching, waiting, analyzing every detail of the scene below. At 0947 hours, Sarah spotted movement on the road leading to the compound. A convoy of 3 vehicles approached from the east, kicking up dust clouds that were visible from miles away. Sarah adjusted her scope and focused on the lead vehicle. Command, this is Overwatch. Convoy approaching from the east. 3 vehicles, approximately 12 personnel. Copy, Overwatch. Primary target likely in the convoy. Prepare for engagement on my command. Sarah's heart rate increased slightly, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. Everything she'd trained for, all the hours of practice and preparation, had led to this moment. Through her scope, she watched the convoy enter the compound and the vehicle stop near the main building. Men emerged from the vehicles, most of them armed with AK-47 rifles and wearing the loose clothing typical of Taliban fighters. Sarah studied each face through her scope, comparing them to the photographs she'd memorized during her mission briefing. Then, she saw him. Rashid Ahmadi stepped out of the second vehicle, a tall man with a distinctive beard and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was dressed more formally than the others, and Sarah could see that the other fighters deferred to him as he walked toward the main building. Command, this is Overwatch. I have visual on primary target. He's moving toward the main building with approximately 6 escorts. Copy, Overwatch. You are cleared hot. Engage when ready. Sarah adjusted her scope for the exact distance to the target, compensated for the wind speed and direction, and settled her crosshairs on Ahmadi's center mass. The man was moving slowly, talking to his companions, completely unaware that he was being observed from a position nearly half a mile away. Sarah's finger found the trigger, and she began the breathing technique she'd practiced thousands of times: inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze. The rifle fired with a sound like thunder in the mountain air, and Sarah watched through her scope as the bullet struck Ahmadi's center mass, dropping him instantly. The compound erupted in chaos. Armed men scattered for cover, shouting orders in Pashto and searching frantically for the source of the shot. Some fired wildly into the surrounding hills, but Sarah's position was too well concealed and too far away for them to locate. Command, this is Overwatch. Target down. Primary objective complete. Excellent work, Overwatch. Continue observation and report on secondary targets. Sarah settled back into her watching position and began identifying the other men in the compound, comparing their faces to the photographs of known Taliban leaders. Over the next hour, she provided detailed intelligence on 6 other high-value targets who had attended the meeting, information that would be used to plan future operations. When the compound finally emptied and Sarah was cleared to withdraw, she carefully packed her equipment and began the long movement back to her extraction point. As she moved across the mountainous terrain, Sarah reflected on what had just happened. She had killed a man. Not in the heat of battle, not in self-defense, but with calculated precision from a distance where he couldn't even see her. It was exactly what she'd been trained to do, exactly the kind of mission that Delta Force snipers were designed for, but it was also the moment when Sarah understood the full weight of what she'd chosen to become. The extraction went smoothly, and within hours Sarah was back at the forward operating base, completing her mission debrief with the intelligence officers who had analyzed the information she'd gathered. The operation was classified as a complete success, primary target eliminated, valuable intelligence collected, no American casualties. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters and called her grandfather's farm in Ohio. Her grandmother answered the phone, and they talked for a few minutes about family news and life back home. Sarah couldn't discuss her mission, couldn't even mention where she was or what she'd been doing, but she needed to hear a familiar voice from the world she'd left behind. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" her grandmother asked. "You sound tired." "I'm okay, Grandma. Just thinking about Grandpa today. He would be proud of you, you know. Whatever you're doing over there, wherever you are, he would be proud." After hanging up, Sarah thought about her grandfather and the lessons he'd taught her about shooting and life. He'd always emphasized that the ability to take a life was a serious responsibility, one that should never be taken lightly or used carelessly. He'd also taught her that sometimes good people had to do difficult things to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah had understood those lessons intellectually during her training, but now she understood them viscerally. The weight of what she'd done, the responsibility that came with her abilities, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for as long as she could remember. For the first time since Jake's death, Sarah felt like she was contributing to something meaningful, using her abilities to protect American soldiers and Afghan civilians from people who wanted to hurt them. Over the next month, Sarah completed 5 more missions in the mountains of Afghanistan. Each one was different in its details but similar in its essential nature: long periods of patient observation followed by precise, calculated action. Sarah's reputation within the special operations community began to grow, and her success rate attracted attention from commanders who specialized in the most difficult and dangerous missions. It was during her 6th mission that Sarah earned the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her military career. She was providing overwatch for a night operation to capture a Taliban bombmaker, positioned on a ridge overlooking a village where the target was believed to be hiding. The mission went wrong almost immediately when the ground team was ambushed by a larger force of insurgents than intelligence had predicted. "Overwatch, this is Alpha Team," came the urgent radio call. "We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate support." Sarah could see the firefight unfolding below her through her night vision scope. The ground team was pinned down in a courtyard, taking fire from at least 3 different buildings. The situation was desperate, and, without immediate help, the American soldiers would be overrun. "Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. I can see your position. Marking targets now." What followed was a display of marksmanship that would be discussed in special operations circles for years afterward. Working by moonlight and using only her night vision scope, Sarah systematically eliminated 7 enemy fighters in less than 2 minutes, each shot fired from a distance of more than 600 meters. Her precision was so exact that the ground team was able to maneuver safely through the village while she provided continuous covering fire. "Jesus Christ," came the odd voice of the team leader over the radio. "Overwatch, I don't know how you're making these shots, but you just saved our asses." "Just doing my job, Alpha Team." When the mission was complete and the team had successfully extracted with their target, the ground team leader approached Sarah with an expression of something approaching reverence. "Chen," he said, "I've worked with a lot of snipers over the years, but what you did tonight was something else. You were like a ghost up there, taking out targets we couldn't even see. The guys are calling you Ghost, and I think it's going to stick. The nickname spread quickly through the special operations community. Sarah Chen had become Ghost, the sniper who could eliminate targets from impossible distances under impossible conditions. Enemy fighters began to whisper stories about an American sniper who could kill from the shadows, someone who could be anywhere and see everything. More importantly, American soldiers began to request Ghost's support for their most dangerous missions. Her presence became a guarantee that Overwatch would be provided by someone with supernatural accuracy and unshakable composure under pressure. But Sarah's growing reputation came with a cost. Each successful mission added another notch to an invisible tally, another life taken in service of a war that seemed to have no clear end. She began to understand why her grandfather had rarely talked about his experiences in Korea, why the old Marine had sometimes gotten a distant look in his eyes when the conversation turned to his military service. The weight of what she was doing, the responsibility that came with her abilities, was something that Sarah would carry for the rest of her life. But she also understood that she was making a difference, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves and serving a cause larger than her own personal comfort. As Sarah prepared for her 7th mission in Afghanistan, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small-town library to the mountains of a foreign war. She thought about the choices she'd made, the training she'd endured, and the person she'd become in the process. She was no longer the quiet librarian who'd felt like she was waiting for her life to begin. She was Ghost, one of the most effective snipers in the American military, a soldier whose reputation was growing with each successful mission. And she was just getting started. 2 years later, Sarah sat in a briefing room at Bagram Airfield, studying satellite photographs of a compound in the mountains near the Pakistan border. The mission briefing was classified at the highest levels, and only 5 people in the room had clearance to know what was being planned. Sarah was there because she had become the go-to sniper for operations that required surgical precision under impossible conditions. The target was Hassan al-Zarqawi, a senior al-Qaeda leader responsible for planning attacks that had killed hundreds of American soldiers and thousands of Afghan civilians. Intelligence indicated he would be meeting with other terrorist leaders at an isolated compound in 3 days, and this represented the best opportunity to eliminate him that the military had had in over a year. "Ghost," said Colonel Martinez, the mission commander, "we need you to tell us if this is possible." Sarah studied the terrain photographs and reconnaissance reports. The compound was situated on a plateau surrounded by steep cliffs, with only one approach road that was heavily guarded. The nearest position that could provide overwatch was a ridgeline 1,200 meters away, well beyond the effective range of most sniper rifles. But Sarah's reputation had been built on making shots that other snipers considered impossible. "The range is extreme," Sarah said, thinking through the ballistics calculations in her head. "At 1,200 meters, I'll be dealing with significant bullet drop and wind drift. The target area has multiple buildings, so I'll need to wait for a clear shot with no civilians in the background." "Can you make the shot?" Martinez asked directly. Sarah looked at the photographs again, noting the elevation difference between the firing position and the target, the prevailing wind patterns in the area, and the time of day when the target was most likely to be exposed. It would require perfect conditions and flawless execution, but it was within the realm of possibility. "If everything goes according to plan, yes, sir. But I'll need special equipment and ideal weather conditions." Martinez nodded. "What do you need?" "An M107 Barrett rifle with match-grade ammunition, a spotting team, and at least 6 hours to prepare the firing position. Also, the shot will have to be made in the early morning when wind conditions are most stable." The Barrett M107 was a .50 caliber rifle capable of accurate fire at extreme distances, but it was also much heavier and more cumbersome than Sarah's usual M24. She trained with the Barrett during her advanced coursework, but this would be the first time she'd used it in combat. "You'll have everything you need," Martinez said. "This operation has been approved at the highest levels. Al-Zarqawi has been responsible for some of the worst attacks against our forces, and eliminating him could save hundreds of American lives." Sarah understood the stakes. Over the past 2 years, she had completed dozens of missions throughout Afghanistan and Iraq, and her confirmed kill count had reached numbers that made even experienced special operations soldiers take notice. She had become a legend within the military community, the sniper that commanders requested when the mission was too difficult for anyone else. But with that reputation came pressure that Sarah had never anticipated. Every mission now carried expectations that went beyond simple success or failure. She was expected to make impossible shots, to succeed where others would fail, to be the solution to problems that had no conventional answers. The weight of those expectations had begun to affect Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. She'd started having trouble sleeping, and, when she did sleep, her dreams were filled with the faces of the people she'd killed. She'd stopped calling home regularly, partly because she couldn't discuss her work and, partly because she was beginning to feel disconnected from the life she'd left behind in Ohio. Margaret had written to her regularly, sending letters filled with news from the library and updates about mutual friends. In her last letter, Margaret had mentioned that she was worried about Sarah, that her responses had become shorter and less personal over time. "You sound different in your letters," Margaret had written. "More distant. I hope you're taking care of yourself over there, and I hope you're not losing sight of who you were before all of this started." Sarah had read that letter several times, wondering if Margaret was right. Had she changed? Was she losing herself in the role she'd chosen, becoming so focused on being Ghost that she was forgetting how to be Sarah Chen? The preparation for the Al-Zarqawi mission took place over the next 48 hours. Sarah worked with her spotter, Sergeant First Class Williams, to establish a hide position on the ridgeline overlooking the target compound. They moved into position under cover of darkness, carrying the heavy Barrett rifle and enough equipment to sustain them for up to 12 hours. The hide itself was a masterpiece of camouflage and engineering. Sarah and Williams spent hours constructing a position that would be invisible from any angle while providing a clear line of sight to the target area. They used natural materials to break up their outline, positioned reflective materials to eliminate scope glare, and created multiple escape routes in case their position was discovered. As dawn approached on the day of the mission, Sarah settled behind the Barrett and began her final preparations. The rifle was significantly different from the M24 she was accustomed to, heavier and more powerful but also more difficult to handle. The .50 caliber round it fired was capable of devastating accuracy at extreme ranges, but it also required perfect technique to achieve that accuracy. Through her scope, Sarah studied the compound 1,200 meters away. At that distance, the buildings looked like miniature models, and individual people were barely visible as moving dots. Making an accurate shot would require accounting for dozens of variables: wind speed and direction, air temperature and humidity, the rotation of the Earth, even the slight differences in elevation between her position and the target. Williams lay beside her with a spotting scope, providing backup observation and wind readings. They had worked together on previous missions, and Sarah trusted his judgment completely. "Wind is steady at 8 miles per hour from the west," Williams whispered. "Temperature is 62 degrees, humidity at 45%. Sarah made adjustments to her scope and settled into her firing position. The compound below was beginning to show signs of activity, but there was no sign yet of the primary target. At 0734 hours, a convoy of vehicles approached the compound from the south. Sarah and Williams watched through their scopes as the vehicles entered the compound and several men emerged. Sarah compared the faces she could see to the photographs she'd memorized, looking for Al-Zarqawi among the group. "Target identified," Sarah whispered. "Main building, second floor balcony." Hassan Al-Zarqawi had emerged onto a balcony overlooking the compound's courtyard. He was speaking with 2 other men, gesturing towards something in the distance. At 1,200 meters, he looked like a small figure through Sarah's scope, but she could make out enough detail to confirm his identity. "Range 1,187 meters, Williams confirmed. Wind steady at 7 miles per hour, quartering from the west." Sarah made her final adjustments and settled her crosshairs on the target. At this distance, the bullet would take nearly 2 seconds to reach its target, and even a small movement by Al-Zarqawi could cause a miss. She would have to time the shot perfectly, anticipating where he would be when the bullet arrived rather than where he was when she pulled the trigger. Sarah controlled her breathing and began the firing sequence she'd practiced thousands of times. But, as she prepared to take the shot, something unexpected happened. A child, a boy who looked to be about 8 years old, ran out onto the balcony and stood next to Al-Zarqawi. Sarah held her fire. The rules of engagement were clear: no shots with civilians in the immediate area, especially children. She would have to wait for a cleaner opportunity. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah watched as Al-Zarqawi moved around the compound, sometimes alone, sometimes with other adults, and sometimes with children nearby. Each time she had a clear shot, something prevented her from taking it: a civilian walking past, a child playing nearby, or another adult moving into the line of fire. "Ghost, this is Command," came the voice over her radio. Status report. "Command, this is Ghost. I have the target in sight but no clean shot. Multiple civilians in the area. Copy, Ghost. Primary target is scheduled to depart the compound at 0900 hours. This may be our only opportunity." Sarah understood the pressure to take the shot. Intelligence on al-Zarqawi's movements was rare, and if he left the compound without being eliminated, it might be months or years before another opportunity presented itself. In the meantime, he would continue planning attacks that would cost American and Afghan lives. But Sarah also understood the rules of engagement that governed her actions. Taking a shot with civilians nearby wasn't just against military policy, it was against everything she believed about the responsible use of force. At 0847 hours, al-Zarqawi emerged from the main building and walked toward the vehicles that would take him away from the compound. For a moment, he was alone in the courtyard, presenting a clear target with no civilians nearby. Sarah settled her crosshairs on the target and began her firing sequence. But, just as she was about to pull the trigger, the same child who had appeared on the balcony ran into the courtyard, chasing a ball that had rolled near al-Zarqawi. Sarah held her fire again, watching through her scope as al-Zarqawi smiled at the child and handed him the ball. The gesture was so human, so normal, that for a moment Sarah forgot she was looking at one of the world's most wanted terrorists. Then, al-Zarqawi walked toward his vehicle, and the child ran back toward the building. For perhaps 3 seconds, Sarah had a completely clear shot with no civilians anywhere near the target. She fired. The Barrett rifle thundered in the mountain air, and Sarah watched through her scope as the .50 caliber bullet covered the distance to its target in just under 2 seconds. Al-Zarqawi was reaching for the door handle of his vehicle when the bullet struck him center mass, the impact dropping him instantly. The compound erupted in chaos as armed men scrambled for cover and searched frantically for the source of the shot. But Sarah and Williams were already packing their equipment and preparing to withdraw. At 1,200 meters, their position was effectively undetectable, and by the time any search teams could reach their area, they would be long gone. "Command, this is Ghost. Target eliminated. Beginning withdrawal. Outstanding work, Ghost. Extraction team is standing by." The withdrawal from the firing position took 2 hours, moving carefully across mountainous terrain to reach the extraction point where a helicopter was waiting. As they flew back to base, Sarah reflected on the mission and what it represented. Al-Zarqawi had been her most significant target, a high-value individual whose death would genuinely impact terrorist operations in the region. The shot itself had been one of the most difficult she'd ever attempted, requiring perfect technique under pressure and split-second timing to avoid civilian casualties. But Sarah also realized that something had changed during those moments when she'd held her fire to avoid harming innocent people. The weight of her responsibilities, the pressure to succeed at any cost, had been balanced by a reminder of why those responsibilities mattered in the first place. She wasn't just a weapon to be pointed at enemies of the United States. She was a soldier with moral obligations, someone whose actions had to be guided by principles that went beyond simple mission success. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters and wrote a letter to Margaret. For the first time in months, she wrote about more than just general updates and safe topics. She wrote about the responsibility she felt, the weight of her decisions, and the importance of maintaining her humanity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. "I think I understand now what my grandfather meant when he talked about the burden that comes with certain abilities," Sarah wrote. "It's not just about being able to do difficult things. It's about maintaining the judgment to know when those things should be done and when they shouldn't." Over the next 6 months, Sarah completed 8 more missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Each one added to her reputation and her confirmed kill count, but they also added to her understanding of what it meant to be a soldier in the most elite units of the American military. When her deployment ended and Sarah returned to the United States, she was approached about extending her service and taking on even more specialized assignments. But she had begun to think about what came next, about how to use the skills and experience she'd gained in service of something beyond warfare. Sarah's military career had transformed her from a small-town librarian into one of the most effective snipers in American military history. She had completed over 50 combat missions, saved countless American lives, and earned the respect of the most elite soldiers in the special operations community. But, perhaps more importantly, she had discovered that true strength wasn't just about the ability to eliminate enemies at impossible distances. It was about the wisdom to make the right decisions under pressure, the courage to hold fire when civilians were at risk, and the humanity to remember that every action had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate mission. As Sarah prepared to transition back to civilian life, she carried with her the knowledge that she had served with distinction in some of the most dangerous and demanding situations the military could offer. She also carried 43 precise notches carved into the stock of her rifle, each one representing a life taken in defense of others, each one a reminder of the weight that came with her particular set of abilities. The librarian from Ohio had become Ghost, and Ghost had become a legend. But Sarah Chen had also learned that legends are made not just by what they accomplish, but by how they choose to accomplish it. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all.